Welcome, everyone. Welcome to a virtual conversation at the Rosenbach. I am Edward G. Pettit, and tonight's program is brought to you by a generous gift from the Rosenbach Literature Program Fund. And for those in our audience tonight who have donated to the Rosenbach or who are members, I can see there's many of you in the audience already. Thank you so much for helping us create programs like tonight's and also to continue to care for our collections. And we also ask all of you who are new to our programs to help support the Rosenbach through donation, which you can do at our website. And I will drop those links into the chat here a little later, but you can also become a member. Members of the Rosenbach get free and exclusive access to some of our programs, plus 10% off any of our reading courses and 50% off any Rosenbach programs. And while I'm at it, let me throw a plug out for our Sundays with Jane Eyre program, airing live every Sunday at 2 p.m. East Coast time on Zoom. And we also live stream it on YouTube. Every week, we take a deep dive into a chapter or two of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, providing a kind of conversational annotation of the novel. We began 2 weeks ago. You can watch past episodes on our YouTube channel, and we'll finish the book in April. That is 30 weeks of Jane, Rochester, and eventually Bertha, the mad woman in the attic. And of course, our authors in conversation tonight will come up often as our scholars, professors, and authors we have on the show discuss Jane Eyre with me. So if you haven't already watched, please join us for Sundays with Jane Eyre. And now, let me introduce our guests for tonight. Our interlocutor for the evening is Judith Newman, author of You Make Me Feel Like an Unnatural Woman, The Diary of a New Older Mother, and also the bestseller, To Siri with Love, A Mother, Her Autistic Son. Judith, welcome. And we'll wait for Judith and while I introduce the others as well. There you are, and unmute too. So I know it's lots of buttons to hit.
Okay,
there you go.
Got it. Thank you very much.
I cut off the end of the title of your book. It's To Siri with Love, and what's the subtitle?
You know,
A Mother, Her Autistic Son,
and the Kindness of Machines.
Thank you. So it was cut off on my script, and I forgot. So. In conversation with Judith tonight, please welcome the authors of the groundbreaking work of literary criticism, The Mad Woman in the Attic, the woman writer in the 19th century literary imagination. And for tonight, the brand new Still Mad, American Women Writers and the Feminist Imagination, available from Norton Books. You can order your copy now if you haven't already done so. Please welcome distinguished literary critic, poet, and professor emerita at the University of California, Davis, Sandra M. Gilbert, and memoirist, literary critic, and professor emerita at Indiana University, Susan Gubar. Hi, Susan.
Thank you so much for having us.
Excellent. All righty. And Sandra will be here in just a second. There we go. Hi, Sandra. Make sure you unmute too, Sandra. I know, so many buttons.
So many buttons.
And let me tell, not yet. Yeah, there's an unmute there on your Zoom interface. Bottom left corner, if you put your cursor over the Zoom interface, you'll see a little microphone there.
I'm so glad you're as technically adept at this time.
There you go. Oh, you had it. Now you turn it again. Hit it one more time. That's it.
There you
all
go.
Set.
Got it.
Oh, no, you muted it again. One more time. Hey, that's all right. We're all still learning this. Even a year late. There you go. Perfect. You are all set.
Don't touch another button there.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. And this is really wonderful to have you all here. Our format for tonight is that Susan and Sandra have prepared a slideshow that we'll present to you, and then Judith will lead some conversation. And if any of you in the audience have questions tonight for our authors, please ask them. What you do is there's a Q&A box on the Zoom interface. Put your questions in the Q&A box, and then Judith will ask the questions, as many as we can get to in the last 10, 15 minutes of the program. And if you have any issues with that, drop them in the chat. I'll find them. Don't worry, and we'll relay them. So we'll get this all we'll get this all taken care of. So, are we all ready tonight?
Certainly.
Excellent. Well, I will start the slideshow.
Okay.
And begin.
Still Mad is a companion to The Mad Woman in the Attic, which we wrote more than 40 years ago, and which deals with women writers in the 19th century. Still Mad simply says that 20th and 21st century women, like their predecessors, are still angry. We began this book when various disabilities made us, can we go to the next slide? Thanks. We began this book when various disabilities made it impossible for us to travel to the 2016 Women's March in Washington, D.C. It reminded us of the 1970s Women's March, though the presiding spirit of each event could not have been more different. In 1970, many feminists believed that the social order was changing and equality was within sight. However, in 2016, most protesters were shocked that a competent and seasoned female candidate had been defeated by a corrupt huckster. What had happened?
Hillary Clinton, next slide, was part of the generation that came of age in the 70s, and contradictions in her life reflect the tensions and ironies that many participants in the second wave of feminism experienced. We were told to reach for the stars, but also to stand by our men. We were encouraged to read Socrates and Plato, but became connoisseurs of sweater sets and pleated skirts. These paradoxes shaped the lives and works of the literary women who gave the second wave its words. Sylvia Plath, for example, wanted to become a triple threat woman, as she put it, to succeed as a wife, a mother, and a poet. The life she led in the 50s and the poetry she produced in the early 60s, Daddy, Lady Lazarus, the Bee Sequence, illuminate the terrible contradictions that destroyed her, even while they made her an icon, as does her posthumously published novel, The Bell Jar. Audre Lorde, on the left here, and Adrienne Rich on the right, with Myrtle Lasser in the middle, became very good friends in the 70s, but in the 50s, they too struggled with the tension between their literary ambitions and their efforts to conform to restrictive views of women's place in the home with husband and children.
Lorraine Hansberry, in the next slide, was one of the few women in the 50s steeped in feminist intellectual history. She studied Mary Wollstonecraft, Sojourner Truth, and Simone de Beauvoir. In her prize-winning play, A Raisin in the Sun, Hansberry suggests that the domestic ideology of the 50s weakens women, and that in any case, this ideology rarely shaped the destinies of most Black women. Like Hansberry, the poet Gwendolyn Brooks, in the next slide. Can we have the next slide? Thank you so much. Gwendolyn Brooks is on the left there. Depicts working class Black women, some alienated from the white women who hired them. All these women composed works about the toxicity of enforced domesticity before 1963, when Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, which is not to take away from her achievement, but to contextualize it. Throughout the 60s, liberal women were organizing in Now, while Nina Simone was extending the insights of the civil rights and the Black Power movements to confront the unique difficulties of Black women. Her evocative 1964 song, For Women, can be read as a feminist polemic, a counterpart to her friend James Baldwin's book, Nobody Knows My Name.
In the 60s, Gloria Steinem wrote about contraception and Playboy bunnies. Her evolution illuminates the link between the sexual revolution and the emergence in the 70s of Ms. Magazine. You see an updated version here of one of its early covers. Later in the 60s, Susan Sontag was one of many women writers, among them Mary McCarthy, Grace Paley, Denise Levertov, active in protests against the Vietnam War. war resistance paved the way for the eruption of feminist protests in the momentous year 1968, when the first witch actions sparked headlines. In the 70s, Sontag would go on to write 3 extraordinary philosophical treatises on feminism, which went largely unread at the time.
By 1970, when Kate Millett published her groundbreaking Sexual Politics and Toni Morrison published her haunting novel, The Bluest Eye, feminism was making headlines. Millett stands for other theorists in the 70s, Shulamith Firestone, for example, Robin Morgan, just as Morrison stands for other novelists in the 70s who focused on the destructive socialization foisted on girls. Erica Jong, Rita Mae Brown, Marilyn French.
James Tiptree on the left, who was really Alice Bradley Sheldon, James Tiptree, Joanna Russ, and Ursula Guin. These are the 3 most significant authors of speculative fiction in the 70s. Like Adrienne Rich, the poet laureate of the second wave, in effect, all 3 imagine the awakening of feminist consciousness in dystopias and utopias. Their heroines discover the horror of patriarchy's power over women, or they seek to envision a good and no longer masculinist world of gender equality. In the 70s, too, Alice Walker and Maxine Hong Kingston linked women's subordination to racial, ethnic, linguistic, geographic, and religious factors. In doing so, they began to lay the groundwork for the ideas about identity politics, transnationalism, and intersectionality that would arise in the 80s. In 1979, Judy Chicago's dinner party, see here, assembled plates representing women artists around a large triangular table to celebrate women's creative achievements, though her mostly white cast of characters and the vaginal images on her plates would soon come under attack as racist or essentialist.
During the last 2 decades of the 20th century, the work of Andrea Dworkin, Gloria Anzaldúa, and Toni Morrison elaborated upon identity politics, transnationalism, and intersectionality, as did Adrienne Rich. Dworkin in her battle against pornography, Anzaldúa in the concept of mestiza consciousness, Morrison in her prize-winning novel Beloved, as well as her critical publications on race and gender, and Rich in essays and poems about being part Jewish, or as she put it, split at the root. By the 90s, academic feminists like Eve Sedgwick on the left, Judith Butler on the right, were responding to the homophobia fueled by the AIDS epidemic to enlist feminists in defending the rights of gay men. In the process, they generated queer theory, as well as much of the language we now use about non-binary, genderqueer, or transgender people.
Such poets as Anne Carson also sought to dismantle outworn gender binaries, as did postmodern entertainers, think of Madonna, and transsexual authors, for instance, Leslie Feinberg and Kate Bornstein. But by the end of the 90s, feminists, radical, liberal, straight, gay, Black, Chicano, post-colonial, post-structuralist, postmodernist, transsexual, third wave, were splintered in an American culture that persistently lumped them all together and denounced them as, in the infamous words of Rush Limbaugh, feminazis. Not pictured here are the women who joined in this backlash against feminism.
So it is a relief to land in the 21st century with Alison Bechdel and Eve Endler, who now calls herself V. In her graphic novels, Fun Home and Are You My Mother, Bechdel explores the impact of the second wave on parents born before it and daughters born after it. In multiple performances of her celebrated play, The Vagina Monologues, as in her subsequent global campaign, 1 Million Rising, Ensler, or V, sought to raise consciousness about ongoing violence against women. In 2008, Susan Stryker, on the left, brought out her transgender history, and in 2016, Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts won the National Critics Circle Award. Both reflect the rise of transgender studies and the prominence of trans as well as non-binary advocates within feminism.
At the same time, feminist writers were aligning themselves with activists against ongoing racial injustice and ongoing environmental threats to the planet. Claudia Rankine's Citizen makes Black Lives Matter, while N.K. Jemisin's Broken Earth trilogy describes the suffering inflicted by cataclysmic climate changes after the acceleration of global warming. As the Me Too movement evolved, Patricia Lockwood's memoir, Priest Daddy, and Rebecca Solnit's essays protested what Solnit called mansplaining in a society that continued to be ruled by patriarchs often vicious in their subjugation of women.
Beyonce is probably the most famous example of the growing impact of feminism on American popular culture today, especially in her movie Homecoming, which repeatedly quotes Audre Lorde, Toni Morrison, and other pioneers of Black feminism. Also a celebrity, Margaret Atwood, in the next slide, whose Handmaid's Tale was reinvented as a TV series at the start of the Trump administration, composed its hopeful sequel, The Testaments, to suggest that sisterhood is still powerful enough to bring about a better world. The feminist imagination continues to rely on utopian and dystopian fantasies. While the second wave was going through a revival in the 21st century, such political figures as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Stacey Abrams, herself a novelist, were mobilizing the disenfranchised to secure their rights under the law.
And they were doing this while Nancy Pelosi was the most powerful woman in American politics, second in line of succession to the presidency. Like many of her colleagues, Pelosi wore a white suit when she tore up Trump's State of the Union speech before television cameras. She wore the white suit to honor the suffragists who themselves wore white and who fueled her anger and paved the path to rebellion.
After the shocking defeat of Hillary Clinton in 2016, it was especially wonderful to celebrate the triumph of Vice President Kamala Harris in 2020, the first woman to rise to such prominence, as well as First Lady Dr. Jill Biden, the First Lady to continue pursuing a professional career out of the White House. Of course, there was backlash against them all, most shockingly on January 6th, when toxic masculinity and proto-fascism raged through Washington, D.C.
Did the glass ceilings feminists had shattered issue in the broken windows of the Capitol? Will mad women always spawn madmen? We managed to evade such a gloomy conclusion when 22-year-old African-American Amanda Gorman recited a poem on the inaugural stage, asserting, "We will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation."
All the women of the feminist movement who met, marched, struggled, and brought our new order into being helped teach her those words, and now would echo them. And that's the end of our slide presentation. And since I think it's now time for you, Judith, to sort of take over.
Thank you. I have so many questions, but first I just want to, since I know a lot of the people here were first introduced to these extraordinary authors back in 1979, I want to bring you back a little bit just for a moment to that time. And it was, for me, it was 1980. It was about a year after Mad Women in the Attic came out, and I was a 19-year-old pre-med student. So I don't know what got me to run out and buy the book, except that I was enthralled to these 19th century novelists. And I was failing organic chemistry, and I kind of was reconsidering my options at this point. So anyway, it was quite literally life-changing because it made me realize medicine was not my future. And so I went back and I just looked at some of my notes that I took in the margins from that book. Just a couple of them. First, are there any women who could be perfect Victorian women? Who are these angels on earth? We're all supposed to interpret the divine for our husbands. Who understands the divine? why do guys prefer women who accomplish nothing with their lives? And I think I was looking at your book at that moment a little bit like a Cosmo essay to try to figure out what it was that women could do to please men. But I think my most astute comment was just in big capital letters, and it just said, Mark Twain and D.H. Lawrence can bite me. Because I believe that they were dissing Jane Austen at the time, and I was very, very irritated about that. But anyway, I read Mad Women with this fury for injustice at 19 that I probably couldn't muster now at 60, but boy, was I reminded of it while reading Still Mad. And I think that nobody writes about women's anger with both intellectual rigor and also a cool gimlet eye of these two women here today. And, I have to say, also, you can be very, very funny. And there's just one quote I want to read to people here. The authors, they're discussing the results of the groundbreaking Kinsey report on human sexual behavior. And they say this, quote, the report emphasizes that, quoting Kinsey, it is difficult for most males to comprehend that females are not aroused by seeing male genitalia, unquote, a reminder that retains its relevance. So I think for any of you men reading this out there, any of you men who are on dating apps, I consider that a word to the wise. At any rate, after this amazing overview of the book, I have a few questions for you. I mean, first of all, the big one is, how did the two of you decide that this volume would be about women's anger as its animating principle? Was this, after what I think of as the Trump hangover, seeing all the damage we're left with as a country and as women, even with the Biden administration?
Well, I just want to correct one thing. We were writing this book during the Trump administration. So we were mad. Everyone was mad during the day. We were mad. We were even feeling like we were going crazy because he was crazy. It was a crazy making experience. And but we really were setting out to write about somebody had asked us to write about 70s feminism. Mm-hmm. And what we realized, what we were originally going to say was that we were originally going to call the book 70s Feminism Today, but that wasn't really a very good title. Still Mad is a much better title, because what we were trying to say was that the spirit of 70s feminism, and indeed even the spirit of the Mad Woman in the Attic, lives on.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
We actually began writing because we couldn't go on the Women's March. We had too many disabilities. Mm-hmm. And we thought, well, if we can't march, the one thing we do know how to do is collaborate. We've done it for years, 40 years more. And we can do something to talk about the history that's at stake when the Trump administration took over. We were also very, very upset, and anger is very close to distress and fear as an emotion. We were very upset that so many white women voted for Trump. And one of the themes of this book is that there have always been, in the second wave, which is what we discuss in this book, from Helene Deutsch to Sandra, who would you go to?
Phyllis Schlafly.
Well, no, I meant now. Well, till Marjorie Greene, let's say.
Yeah. Yes.
There have been anti-feminist white women who have been very provocative and provocateurs. But in the center of it, at the 70s, is, as Sandra said, Phyllis Schlafly. So we wanted to, that's one thread in this book, a question about what that history means and what it adds up to, and what feminists need to do about that in the future.
Yep.
I should just add that, at Phyllis Schlafly's funeral, Donald Trump was one of the major speakers.
You're kidding.
Incredible. So it's a very interesting intellectual history this is a book about intellectual and social history. Yes. And Trump to us represents, misogyny and backlash.
Yes, well, I mean, to your point here, there were, you talk a couple of times how Erica Young said that she explained women's turning against women and feminism by saying, when we are unable to turn our assertiveness against men, we turn it against each other. And Phyllis Chesler said, my feminist generation ate our leaders. And so I was wondering, do you think, how do we combat this kind of divisiveness today?
Wait, that's a slightly different, can I just say, that's a slightly different issue. It's a slightly different issue because there's one issue, which is the Trump ladies, let's say, or the Trump women, and the Schlafly Trump line of descent, right? And then there's another issue, which is infighting among and between feminists.
Right.
Feminism, like almost every radical political group, it becomes so intense that people get angry at each other. And also another reason that feminists fight with each other is there's a long historical reason for women believing that there's only room for one woman at the top. That goes back to Sylvia Plath writing in her journal about how she just would have to defeat Adrienne Rich if she wanted to be the poetess of America, because there couldn't be 2 or 3 or 4 poetesses of America, though there were certainly many male poets of America. So there are 3 issues, I think I'm saying.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I think what Sandra's pointing out is the long history of tokenism.
Right.
And when there was only one token woman, what need one? You only needed one. You had to have one on the committee, right? You had to have one. But if you could only have one, you could see that women would fight for that one spot. But she's also making another point that there were disputes within feminism, and those disputes, as upsetting as they could be, and they were very upsetting, they were called trashing in the 70s. That's what they were known as. They could also issue in interesting conversations whose tensions would, bring out new nuances of ideas. So in the 80s, there was Dworkin, who we mentioned, who was anti-pornography, and what arose against her within feminism were feminists who called themselves pro-sex, who thought of Dworkin as kind of a prude and a Puritan, and just anti-male. And so, and out of those conversations came very nuanced legislation, even about pornography and about obscenity.
Well, do you think the equivalent now is kind of the Me Too movement in terms of dividing feminists? Because I see that constantly, the arguments that I've had with people about where we draw the line of what's an assault and what's
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know. I don't tend to think that the Me Too movement divides feminists. I think certainly as it originated, and was in fact originated by a Black woman, Tarana Burke, it was about violence against women, and it was like, I've suffered that too, and I don't want to see this sort of thing go on. I mean, it was supportive of not quite Dworkin's position, but the legislation that Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon were responsible for. I don't see it fragmenting.
But I think Judith is absolutely right. I mean, some people will think patting someone on the back is, offensive, and other people will think it's not really that offensive. It's not.
Yeah,
really
that's true. That's true. That's true.
I think Judith is talking about, and I think once again that's something that will lead to more subtle analyses of how we define something that is offensive or something that is dehumanizing and degrading and violent.
I agree with that. I agree with that.
That these conversations are extremely healthy. I will say that I think many African American women did feel until very recently that it was mostly white victims who were getting the spotlight. But I think that's no longer the case. I think that.
Oh, no, I think a lot of people still feel it right now with the missing white woman syndrome. In the case of Gabby.
It's been talked about the last few days, right? Right.
Yeah, well, it's an incredible mass obsession with this one lovely 22-year-old white girl, woman. And that's raised that question all over again.
Yeah.
Right. No, absolutely. It's,
Yeah.
I mean, I was going to ask you too about that, how you mentioned in your book how Shirley Chisholm, 35 years after she was elected to the House of Representatives, she recalled facing far more discrimination being a woman than being Black. And then, we don't need to have a hierarchy of oppression really, but do you agree with Susan Sontag's later, her statement that oppression of women is the most ancient form, that it predates all oppression based on class, caste, or race?
I absolutely do. I absolutely do. I mean, before, it is the model for other forms of oppression. I mean, there's a way in which when women are infantilized, then people of color, when they're colonized, are infantilized. But women, in a sense, were colonized from the beginning. Women became a colony that was ruled by men. All women everywhere. I mean, there is no culture that has been found yet by anthropologists that is in fact matriarchal. There are cultures that are matrilineal. There are cultures that have, fantasies of matriarchy, but no culture in which men do not, in some sense, control and thereby colonize women, assuring their paternity of the women's children. I mean, it's because the father.
Yeah, sorry.
This is one of the reasons that we say that the feminist imagination is deeply utopian, because we're arguing that such equality has really never existed, and what it has to be dreamt into and envisioned. It has to be something that you see imaginatively. So that's one of the themes of the book, and that's why Ursula Le Guin and Tiptree and people like that played such an important role. And they did write about all female egalitarian societies, but they were imagined.
Right, but it's interesting that we do juxtapose them with Adrienne Rich, who I claimed as the poet, we claimed as the poet laureate of feminism, which she essentially was. Especially at the height of her fame when she produced Diving into the Wreck, which all of us read with such fervor at that time. She had a utopian dream. She had a utopian vision. And she also saw the world in which she was living, the patriarchal world, as a dystopia.
I want to get back to Chisholm though, because I was very struck by that too, that she felt much more prejudiced against as a woman than as an African American. It was very shocking to us to learn that there weren't women's bathrooms in the Senate until the 90s.
I read that. I couldn't believe that.
Yeah, that really came, writers also get very sort of hilarious. We get hysterical over some of the things we discover. And that brings me to the last point that I wanted to make about this question. It was Sontag that you were quoting as seeing patriarchal culture as primary. That was something we discovered in this book too, because we didn't know her feminist essays in the 70s. Yeah. We only read them as we were doing research for the book, and they are extraordinary. They're hidden in the back of an edition that her son put out. I think
it's a Library of America edition of her book that was edited by her son, but she herself had never included them in any of her wildly popular intellectual anthologies of her own work. She had never included them. She had somehow suppressed them, and he puts them just at the end of the book as if it's a little postscript.
And 3 unpublished essays. Do you have any idea why she didn't include them?
I think she was a closeted lesbian, and I think she was a closeted feminist.
Well, her biographer says that she wanted to be known as an American intellectual. She didn't want to be, and so being a feminist would have put her on the margins. Being a lesbian would have put her on the margins. She wanted to be at the center of the intellectual East Coast establishment. I don't know if we should tell the story about Susan Sontag and Adrienne Rich, but
it's in their biography.
One of the things that we loved writing this book, we loved writing biographically, which we have not done that much except the Norton Head Notes for an anthology. So we intermix biography in this book because we're interested in showing the ways in which the tensions in the lives create the artistry that has this imaginative and feminist impulse. And
as we're reading the lives, we found ourselves reading lives as if they were texts, which was a very exciting thing to do.
Yes. And one of the things that cracked us up is that Adrienne Rich took issue with one of Sontag's essays in the New York Review of Books. And apparently we read in her biography. Sandra, you want to tell the story?
Yes, well, there was a infamous exchange of letters between them in which Rich took Sontag to task for not writing in a feminist way about, what was the name of that? The German, the cinema.
Riefenstahl.
About Leni Riefenstahl, right. And they said, we've got to discuss this in person. We only live a few blocks from each other on the Upper West Side. So they got together in Sontag's apartment, and after a few hours of debate and discussion, they fell into bed together.
As one does.
Right.
It was a remarkable period, the 70s. It was truly a remarkable period.
Nothing more stimulating than intellectual debate.
Absolutely, not that I would know, but yes, absolutely. I wonder about many things. You know, anger and debate are such great motivators in people's lives. I wondered about, have either of you been so angry in your personal and professional lives that it's moved you forward in some way?
I have, certainly. I mean, Susan has what? Susan, I don't think as much as I. Well, no, you had a bad time.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you, Sandra.
I'm sorry. You had some bad times. Well, you told one story.
Very often they turned into stories that made me laugh. So but yes, I was angry at the beginning. At the moment, I was actually quite angry. When I arrived in the English department at Indiana University, which I must say, before I tell the story, has been extremely supportive of me and Sandra and has supported us throughout this book in particular. But when I arrived in 1973 at the English department, a senior professor of English handed me his syllabus to type because he assumed I was a secretary.
Seriously? I do remember reading, I think you were one of it was a big department and you were the first two women or one of.
There were three or four women, but they were sort of wives of professors and it was all very odd, you know. But then it became a story and then it became funny, you know, and then it became something that could be maybe even be galvanizing.
Yes.
So,
but I had a much more serious cause for anger. I had wanted to stay in California. I had lost a job at a state university, which shall be nameless, and for reasons that had to do with ridiculous department politics. And the obvious job for me would be in my husband's department at the University of California, Davis. But they said, "Oh no, there's no way. We wouldn't want two people with one salary, two husband and wife with the same in the same department." There were rules against. There were nepotism rules, and so the reason that I met Susan, it turned out to be very fortunate, is that I decided that even though I had 3 young children, I had to apply outside of California, and Indiana made me an offer that would have been very, very hard to refuse. So we attempted it. After that, Davis thought, "Oh, well, we think so highly of Indiana. If Indiana thinks that highly of her, well, maybe we better hire her, or else maybe they'll hire our guy, my husband." But that was very anger making. That was very frustrating. And
it was
even
also very disruptive to your life. I mean, you had to commute. The kids were young. It was very complicated. But on the other hand, the collaboration was born.
Right.
That's amazing. There's so many things in this book when people read it, just sometimes very small things that will make your jaw drop, that that you just, the one that immediately comes to mind is, what do you mean women couldn't get their own credit card when they, before 1973? I mean, there's so much of those little tidbits in the book that people really have to read going forward. But at any rate, I wondered too, for younger women who might be listening in today, in their 20s and 30s, and men for that matter, who would you tell them that they must be reading right now to formulate their own perspectives on feminism, and why?
I would still want them to read some of the, the sort of masterworks that we discuss. I would still want them to read Sexual Politics by Kay Millett. I would want them to read Simone de Beauvoir. I would want them to read these Sontag essays, which are so marvelous. I mean, there are recent books that are quite interesting, and we talk about some of them, in Still Mad. But I think, they're not old chestnuts. They're, very fiery, hot chestnuts that should be read by all young people.
Right.
And I think everybody should read A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf and Three Guineas.
Yes. Yeah. I'm sorry, Susan. What was
I think the young readers are still very responsive to Bell Hooks's work. And I think they also, a lot of the young readers I know really enjoy reading Rebecca Solnit.
Okay. Great.
I mean, especially the collection called Men Explain Things to Me, where she talks about mansplaining. But her recent memoir is extremely beautiful and very.
I haven't read, so now see,
it's lovely. It's just lovely.
Okay.
Really lovely.
These are the kind of recommendations that I very much take to heart. I loved how Hillary Clinton famously said that a woman doesn't need to be an either or person when she was trying to ingratiate herself as a young attorney / first lady of Arkansas. That, sort of giving the idea that you could do it all. You could be a senator and bake cookies, I guess, even though she didn't want to at the time. But I'm wondering if you think at this point in our time, do you think we're making more progress in that direction, or is leaning in a kind of a fallacy?
Leaning in is a great idea, but if you're leaning in, you really need childcare if you're a mother. You have to lean out to get the kids to preschool, or you have to lean out to get enough money to pay a nanny. There's still no solution in this country for the issue of childcare with that is.
Yeah.
One of the reasons that we argue in this book that the second wave goes from the 1950s all the way up to the present moment is because we think that some of the problems that started to get addressed and solved in the 70s are still being addressed and are still unsolved, and that either or thing is still operative for most women. I mean, an exceptional woman can bake cookies and work as president of the United States, maybe, but we're not interested in tokenism. That's the whole point of feminism.
But what's extraordinary, I do want to note, is that the possibilities for women, possibilities have opened up, but the problems remain the same.
Yeah.
The problems haven't gone away, even while the possibilities are there. So, I used to tell my classes that I am a living example of the possibilities. 50 years ago, I couldn't have been standing in front of you in this pantsuit, teaching this course and writing on this blackboard, right? And lecturing to 200 of you. That wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have been imaginable even. 50 years ago, professors were tweed jacketed men with pipes and, heavy big shoes. They weren't wearing, stylish boots but the problems are still there.
They're not only there, but we keep revisiting them in new ways. I mean, this is what's extraordinary to me. I was going to ask you, you talk in the book about how the women's lives and feminism really were revolutionized, of course, by the pill. And I was thinking, what is going to be the next breakthrough? Is there going to be another breakthrough that's going to have a similar profound effect? Because would you have guessed back in 1960 or even 1970 that we would be where we are with women's reproductive rights now, because I wouldn't have.
No.
Yeah.
But that really returns us to the issue of the backlash against feminism and this backlash against women. The Texas situation is just the edge of the tip of the iceberg, I'm afraid, because Mississippi is going to come before the Supreme Court. Roe v. Wade is going to be relitigated, and it's a terrible situation. And I would link it also to the rise of to the lineage of Schlafly to Trump.
Well, I really had this idea in my head that in some ways, ironically, Trump united feminists in a way that that hadn't happened before. And I sort of have hopes for that this is going to be, even the awfulness of Texas is going to be so galvanizing that that's something that in the next couple of years will become so important to women that we won't have a bloodbath in 2022. That's at least
I couldn't agree more. I think that at the turn of the century, in the 90s especially, the 1990s, there was a kind of fracturing of feminism and a lot of disagreement among different forms of feminists. And there was also a kind of fracture between the theoretical people, the people in the academy who started talking amongst themselves, and the activists on the street. There was a kind of bifurcation. And I think what Trump did was make everybody realize how much is at stake to heal that division.
Yeah.
And how very important solidarity is.
He reignited activism. I mean, it is really true about the 90s. I don't even think that there was that what Susan is saying is exactly the way I feel. I feel that in the 90s, feminism just withdrew inside the ivory tower. It really became an ivory tower movement, and its leading theoreticians spoke in academic language that was I couldn't imagine my mother or my daughter, who are not academics, being interested in. I think that now it is true that because of Trump, women are on the march again.
Yeah.
At the same time, feminism in the 90s was being co-opted in the marketplace. It was being used to sell Botox. It was being used to sell President Barbie dolls. I mean, so it was getting it every which way. It was a very—
Don't knock Botox. Botox makes many of us happy. But no, that's absolutely true. You're absolutely right. I wonder, I'm realizing, I better go to questions here because I don't want to leave anybody out. Wait, let me take a quick look here. Let's see here. Barbara Nelson is asking, what would you wish you had included in either book that perhaps, I guess, that you didn't, and what is your editing process like?
Well, I can tell you one thing I feel bad about not doing more with is Mary McCarthy. I've been haunted by the group. And I think we put Mary McCarthy in where she belongs with the women who were very, very powerful in the anti-Vietnam protest, with Jane Fonda and with Susan Sontag. But I do, that's something I would have done more with if I could have. Sandra, do you have any regrets?
No, I mean, there were so many. I'm particularly interested in the poets we included, and there are so many more poets that we could have written about. But I mean, I think we were aware that we were really choosing representative lives and works, and we were going to read them all in that way. And same thing with, there were things that when we were writing The Mad Woman in the Attic that were not available to us, so we couldn't have included. I don't know, we were writing about literary women who were, they were the only ones we knew. There was no such thing as courses in literature by women. So there were many other poets, for example, in 19th century England and in 19th century America that we excavated for the Norton Anthology of Literature by Women later on. And we could have, written about them then, but we didn't know them. They weren't available.
The question was about our editorial process, and I don't know if the questioner wanted to know about our collaborative process or the one we have with our editor.
Well, I'm curious about your collaborative process.
Yeah, well, we do is we go over, we do write different
Each have your
sections.
areas, or do you write?
We do divide things up, but then we go over absolutely every word. Each of us goes over every word of every chapter. And in the end, what emerges, I would say, is what I think of as our collaborative voice, which is not quite the same as the voice that either of us has in her own work. It's a kind of third voice that's a little bit uncanny. And then I can trace it back to the work on The Mad Woman in the Attic, too. I mean, it's things that have emerged like that.
Did you ever have like a big fight about somebody?
Oh,
Yeah, we've had fights. We've had quite a few struggles, I would say. But generally, what happens is that something better emerges out of that disagreement. Something more
Out of
nuanced.
anger, right?
Something a little bit more nuanced, and layered. But what I was going to say is before you mentioned that is that all the other books we could get together in one place. And this is the only book we've ever written together where we couldn't be in one room with 2 laptops or 2 notebooks and 2 pencils. I mean, we had to do all of this on the phone. I mean, we exchanged drafts and then we would actually read the revised drafts and then we would get on the phone and go line by line through. And we were very glad we had something called speakerphone.
We're not technologically sophisticated. We couldn't enter each other's texts the way you can with that program. What is it? Visit my computer or join my laptop or something. Go to meeting. Go to meeting.
Yeah. No.
Go to meeting. Right. Oh, we couldn't do that. We didn't know how to do that, and just as well because I think that we really like to talk things through. Yeah. I think it's that we do talk things through, and sometimes when we're writing something jointly, one will start a sentence and the other will finish it, and then we'll go back, and then but we're talking about it, and we're doing it in the moment.
Yes. Wait, let me make sure I get the other person's. Let's see. This is Judith Schwartz, who says, it's been a while since I read much of Mad Woman in the Attic assigned in a class at Columbia, but I need to know whether you consider this reading of Jane Eyre a post-colonial one, and why or why not, and thank you. This is incredible and brilliant and needed by everyone right now. Okay. I'm not sure of this reading of Jane Eyre that they're talking, but obviously you will be. So,
well, our reading of Jane Eyre in Mad Woman in the Attic has been taken to task.
Right. Oh, okay.
Task for not doing enough. It was specifically by Gayatri Spivak, the leading post-colonial feminist, so far as I know, and she felt that we didn't do enough, and I was mostly responsible for that. That I had not done enough with the figure of Bertha as a colonized other and as a racialized racial other. I think that's probably true, but we were at that time really operating on the Susan Sontag premise that the primordial hierarchy is the hierarchy of man-woman, and that Bertha as Jane's enraged double speaks for Jane's feelings of abuse and distress at the situation in which she finds herself as a servant to Rochester, right?
Yeah. Let me check. I think I want to check and make sure that I'm not leaving anybody out. No, I don't think I am. So I may need to throw this back to Edward if he's there.
You have a final one you want to ask, Judith, or?
Yeah, let me just look for a sec. I think there's so much when you talked about 19th century women writers, when you wrote about them, it was like being the celebratory dinner party, but also a mourning for their suffering and their struggle to be artists and acceptable as women. But who right now, if you could invite women to the celebration, would you have, who would be your dinner party right now?
I would invite the whole book. I would invite everybody that we wrote about in this book, except for Phyllis Schlafly.
Yeah. Oh, wait. And I bet you wouldn't invite Anita Bryant either.
No, not Anita Bryant, right? No, but I mean, I would say that most of
that, another very important part of that lineage. Right. Anita Bryant. Yeah, absolutely. There are a few women we would not invite, but we also might want to invite some of our earlier heroines like Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley and Virginia Woolf and Charlotte Bronte. It would be very crowded. It might be a cocktail party.
It might, yeah, it would be a little hard to have everybody at the table. Well,
yeah,
I still,
might be a great ball, like it might be a huge dance party.
That's right. Could I request, since this is about 70s feminism, can I request a lot of disco at this party? Would that be okay?
Sure.
Absolutely.
You guys have been absolutely wonderful. And is there anything that the two of you feel that you want people to know about this book before they sit down and devour it?
I would like to note that, unlike Mad Woman, this book really does focus a lot on the political, social, and historical context in which the literary texts were written. It isn't just a series of literary texts and lives, but it's a history. And this had to be because in the 19th century, our women and the Mad Woman in the Attic were not out in public in the way in which women now are. I mean, that is one of the possibilities that has opened up. So we do talk about Hillary Clinton and Nancy Pelosi and Amanda Gorman and Dr. Jill Biden. We really talk about public women, Stacey Abrams, AOC. But in the Mad Woman, we really had to focus on uncovering what was hidden in those texts. What was hidden in those texts isn't really hidden now anymore. It's much more overt.
The idea of the anxiety of authorship, we could safely put that in the past, you think?
Yeah, I think there's an anxiety.
I think so. There's a lineage now. There's no sense that being a woman and a writer is a contradiction in terms any longer.
Right.
I think I'd like to end just by quoting our last epigraph because it's so moving. It's from Even Boland, the poet. And she writes, "Our future will become the past of other women."
It's just mind-boggling, really beautiful.
Yeah, it is. It's a lovely thing to think about. I'm so honored that I got a chance to talk to the two of you today.
Oh, thank you so very much,
Thank you so much for your wonderful questions.
And you changed the lives of so many people who you're talking to right now. And with that, I go back to you.
Great.
Edward.
Thank you. I absolutely, second those sentiments as well. This was really great. As I'm sitting here in my tweeds and my pipe, I'm thinking, yeah, but now I'm thinking, yes, I want, please bring all the mad, the still mad to me. So I love it. That's one of the reasons why, one of the great things we get to explore in the Sundays with Jane Eyre, but it's beyond books and it's beyond literature. It is especially as your new book, goes into. It's about politics, it's about society, and it's about the lives we lead now, which we want to make better for women and for everyone going forward. So I thank you all for your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. And thanks to the Rosenbach Literature Program Fund for providing funds for this program tonight. Thank you all in the audience for joining us for tonight's program. If you are looking for more virtual engagement, head on over to the Rosenbach website. Check out the other virtual offerings we have, including our gallery gateways and exhibitions. And the Rosenbach is also open to visit. So see our website for how we're making it safe for you to come see our exhibitions and historic house in person. And please support the Rosenbach, which you can do by donation. And if you're not already a member, I invite you to join. Judith, Susan, and Sandra, thanks for a great evening. I love
Cheers
this.
to
And
all of you. This is in order, believe me.
good.
Thank you.
Excellent. All righty. Farewell, readers. May you live entirely for and with what you love best on earth. Good night.
Good night.